And so thank you all very much for joining us for the second annual Kenneth Boulding Lecture. And so I started this last year with Pete Boettke to kick us off and give us an overview of Boulding's thought and how it relates to the mainline perspective in matters of peace. And I thought it would be good to kind of formalize it as a regular event, to have a kind of pause in our regular virtual seminar and have a expert in peace studies spend some time thinking about and talking about some of the most pressing issues as it pertains to peace from the mainline perspective. And so I was very grateful that our colleague and friend Nathan Goodman, who's a senior fellow at the F.A. Hyde program, was willing to give the talk. And Nathan, as you know, is a productive scholar and teacher in the areas of mainline economics and political economy. He's done extremely important work on the political economy of immigration, but even beyond that, more broadly, in market process theory and in peace studies. And so Nathan is going to spend some time speaking with us today about peace economics with an anarchist squint. And so, Nathan, let me turn it over to you, and you can take it away. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. I'm delighted to be delivering the second annual Kenneth Boulding Lecture. For a lecture series on mainline economics and peace studies, there's no better namesake. Boulding made groundbreaking contributions to our understanding of peace and conflict in influential books such as Stable Peace and Conflict and Defense, a General Theory. He also coined the phrase mainline economics. Today, we typically associate mainline economics with our colleague, mentor, and friend, Pete Boettke. But Pete learned that phrase from his teacher, Kenneth Boulding. While mainstream economics refers to what is currently fashionable among the top economists in our profession, the stuff in the top journals, the stuff being published by the economists at the top schools, and so on, mainline economics, by contrast, refers to a core set of insights and propositions that economists have studied and advanced since the days of Adam Smith. These propositions are, first, that there are limits to the benevolence that individuals can rely on, and that individuals face cognitive and epistemic limits as they negotiate the social world. So we can think of this as rational choice and response to incentives in a context with fallible individuals. Second, mainline economists believe that formal and informal institutions guide and direct human activity. And so, therefore, social cooperation is possible without central direction. Or, as Pete sometimes puts it, we derive the invisible hand theorem from the rational choice postulate via institutional analysis. This way of seeing the world brings the tools of rational choice theory and its study of incentives, costs, benefits, and constraints to the table. It studies real people with limited knowledge rather than hyper-rational agents with complete information. And it situates these individuals in an institutional context so that we can understand how they cooperate from the bottom up. The relevance of this framework for understanding peace in society is clear, or at least it should be clear, right? With agents that are limited in their knowledge and benevolence, we cannot assume that peace is inevitable. Yet at the same time, we see that peace is possible under at least some institutional arrangements. Through institutional analysis, we can understand how ordinary people sustain peaceful social cooperation. Mainline economists have worked to understand peace from the very beginning. As Adam Smith wrote, quote, "Little else is requisite to carry a state to the highest degree of opulence, from the lowest barbarism, but peace, easy taxes, and a tolerable administration of justice." We saw a similar emphasis on peace from 20th century mainline economists. Boulding is the obvious example. He studied the matter in more depth than most did, but he wasn't alone in his focus on peace. Consider Ludwig von Mises, who wrote, quote, "Society has arisen out of the works of peace. The essence of society is peacemaking. Peace and not war is the father of all things. Only economic action has created the wealth around us. Labor, not the profession of arms, brings happiness. Peace builds, war destroys. Mainline economists have offered us a powerful set of tools for understanding peace and its benefits. Yet many mainline economists, including Smith, Mises, and 20th century Nobel laureates such as James M. Buchanan and Douglas North, placed strong emphasis on the formal state as a necessary means to secure peace and the tolerable administration of justice. I argue that we can understand a broader range of paths to peace if we combine our knowledge of mainline economics with a complementary analytical tool. The analytical tool I hope to offer you is what the political scientist and anthropologist James C. Scott called the anarchist squint. In his book, Two Cheers for Anarchism, Scott writes, quote, "I am making a case for a sort of anarchist squint. What I aim to show is that if you put on anarchist glasses and look at the history of popular movements, revolutions, ordinary politics, and the state from that angle, certain insights will appear that are obscured from almost any other angle. It will also become apparent that anarchist principles are active in the aspirations and political action of people who have never heard of anarchism or anarchist philosophy. One thing that heaves into view, I believe, is what Pierre-Joseph Proudhon had in mind when he first used the term anarchism, namely mutuality, or cooperation without hierarchy or state rule. Another is the anarchist tolerance for confusion and improvisation that accompanies social learning, and confidence in spontaneous cooperation and reciprocity. Here, Rosa Luxemburg's preference, in the long run, for the honest mistakes of the working class over the wisdom of the executive decisions of a handful of vanguard party elites is indicative of this stance. My claim, then, is fairly modest. These glasses, I think, offer a sharper image and better depth of field than most of the alternatives." End quote. When I read this passage, I am reminded of Pete Boettke's point about price theory and economics generally as a set of eyeglasses. Whether you're putting on price theory eyeglasses or an anarchist squint, you're using theory as an aid to your mind in order to bring particular features of social reality into sharp relief. Some of the same features are highlighted. Just as Scott's anarchist squint emphasizes cooperation without command and the power of social learning through experimentation, price theory, especially in its Austrian variants, emphasizes the value of social learning from the bottom up, experimentation and discovery, and cooperation without command. Viewing the world with an anarchist squint brings some phenomena into sharp relief. Crucially, it draws our attention, our analytical attention, to questions of how people make peace with each other when they cannot rely on the state, do not wish to rely on the state, or view the state as a threat rather than as a protector. In other words, an anarchist squint helps us explore the everyday forms of bottom-up governance that people use to sustain peace without relying upon state power. Some, influenced by the Hobbesian view that anarchy leads us inevitably towards a war of all against all, may view this as impossible, or at least vanishingly unlikely. Yet, as Elise Boulding shows in her book, Cultures of Peace, people engage in bottom-up peacemaking all the time. My colleagues and I have been exploring how this happens through a wide range of research projects. For instance, in Peacemaking, Top-Down versus Bottom-Up, Chris Coyne surveys some of the literature and calls for further research on bottom-up peace. He also advances the notion of pax hominem, peace of human beings, which he contrasts directly with pax imperium, or peace of empires. Michaela Novak, Yahya El-Shami, and I explore multiple mechanisms for bottom-up peacemaking in a forthcoming paper in the Journal of Pacifism and Nonviolence titled Polycentric Peace. We examine how market exchange, civil society, and social contact can help people build peace from the bottom up. In this, we build on a broader literature in mainline economics that Pete Boettke calls analytical anarchism. As he explains in Anarchism as a Progressive Research Program in Political Economy, as well as a more recent book chapter with Rosalino Candela, analytical anarchism studies endogenous rule formation. Rather than treating institutions and governance as exogenously imposed by the state, this approach analyzes how they can be developed from the bottom up, often under challenging and hostile conditions. From pirate ships to prison gangs, from greedy traders to the Lex Mercatoria, from forests to fisheries to irrigation to open source software, from contentious social movements to communities rebounding from disaster, careful examination of the social world shows us that self-governance is possible. But even if it's possible, perhaps it cannot last without a state to protect it. Some say that stateless self-governance can sustain cooperation within a group and even create significant amounts of wealth, but that once self-governing people create wealth, they will attract states that seek to conquer them. Those with a militarized state will be better able to fight off such conquest. Those in cooperative anarchy, it is argued, will remain vulnerable to conquest. This is how Alex Salter and Vincent Geloso, in their paper State Capacity and Economic Development, Causal Mechanism or Correlative Filter, explain the correlation between state capacity and economic development. It's not that state capacity is necessary for wealth creation, but rather that wealth attracts the banditry of conquering states, and therefore you will either have state capacity to fend that off, or you will be conquered by a state that has it. But are stateless societies necessarily vulnerable to conquest? Surely this depends on the particulars. James C. Scott's book, The Art of Not Being Governed, documents communities in upland Southeast Asia that fled to the hills to effectively evade state formation and control. These days, Chris Coyne and I, along with co-authors such as Garrett Wood and Yahya al-Shami, study various forms of polycentric defense, the nature of the defensive goods they provide, and the ways they address collective action problems. This can range from violent modes of defense, such as volunteer battalions, to nonviolent social movements engaged in what political scientist Gene Sharp calls civilian-based defense. Viewing the world with an anarchist squint offers additional insights beyond illuminating non-state governance, peacemaking, and defense. It also helps us understand the corrosive nature of systems of top-down authority, power, and control, as well as the ways these systems reinforce one another. An anarchist squint helps us see that states are not primarily cooperative ventures to provide public goods or protect contractually agreed upon rights. It helps us see that they are not benevolent despots dreamed up by economists to correct market failures and move us towards an idyllic state of Pareto optimality. No, states instead are systems of rulership, domination, and coercive social control. Importantly, for those of us concerned with the study of peace, states use violence and the threat of violence against both their citizen subjects and people abroad. Moreover, the coercive tools of social control that states cultivate in one arena enhance their coercive powers in all spheres of life. Vincent Ostrom wrote of how enforcing rules implies a, quote, radical inequality between rulers and those who are ruled, end quote. Entrusting the state with coercive powers is, according to Vincent Ostrom, a Faustian bargain in which we trust the rulers to use instruments of evil to do good. Even if you agree with a particular use of these instruments of evil, beware that they are likely to be redeployed elsewhere. As Chris Coyne and Abby Hall document in their excellent book, Tyranny Comes Home, the physical and human capital cultivated through foreign interventions have been brought home to the United States in order to militarize the police, build a surveillance state, and even enable soldiers turned cops to torture suspects, as they did infamously in Chicago. My current research on the militarization of US border security efforts is inspired by this line of reasoning. The drones, surveillance towers, and militarized border patrol teams that police US borders are using skills, tactics, and equipment originally developed to wage wars abroad. But as Chris Coyne and I show in our paper, US Border Militarization and Foreign Policy, a Symbiotic Relationship, the Border Patrol's militarized capabilities are also directed abroad to carry out various foreign policy objectives. For instance, according to Harshawalia, quote, US Customs and Border Protection has trained 15,000 border agents from 100 different countries. end quote. This includes Afghanistan and Iraq during the US occupations of these countries. It wasn't just US soldiers that were operating in Iraq in order to engage in nation building and reconstruction efforts. It was US Border Patrol agents associated with the Border Patrol Tactical Unit, or BORTAC, the Border Patrol's top SWAT team. Moreover, as I show in a recent paper in Constitutional Political Economy, the militarized powers of the Border Patrol are used against US citizens even far from the border. BORTAC has been deployed to US cities to police protests. The Border Patrol's drones fly not just on the border, but over American cities and towns to carry out a wide range of surveillance activities for federal, state, and local law enforcement. Tools of social control cannot be easily confined to one policy arena. State actors are creative, ambitious, and constantly turning their coercive tools and skill towards new aims. And their creative efforts at control threaten freedom and autonomy for everyone else. In other words, power and control in one sphere tend to spill over into other spheres. This does not just occur between different forms of state control. Adopting an anarchist squint means casting a critical eye on all forms of power and domination, not merely state power. This includes the power of husbands over wives in highly patriarchal contexts. It includes the power secured by privileged groups in racist systems, the power majorities exercise over stigmatized minorities, and the power of bosses and economic elites over ordinary workers and consumers within certain contexts. Mainline economics helps us shed light on how these forms of oppression and control are entangled with one another, and especially the power of the state. For instance, Randall Holcomb's work on political capitalism helps us understand how the power of economic elites is maintained via crony relationships with political elites. Jamie Lemke's work on the political economy of women's rights helps us understand the role of legal barriers in maintaining women's subjugation, as well as the role of exit and mobility in eroding that oppression. Lately, Jamie has also been working with Abby Hall on some work that helps us better understand the effect of militarism on women. Michaela Novak, Jordan Lofthouse, and I are working on an edited volume that will bring together mainline contributions to understanding LGBTQ emancipation. And Michaela's forthcoming volume on liberal emancipations offers us tools for understanding emancipatory social change across a wide range of social contexts. When it comes to social change, many people think of it as mediated through the state. Through this lens, the goal is to change public policy. An anarchist squint helps us see alternative social paths to change. There may be public choice reasons to see little hope for changing policy at any given time, but there may be many opportunities for people to evade bad policies or create bottom-up social relationships that mitigate their harm. Anarchists have spoken about this in various ways. For instance, the industrial workers of the world call it building the new world in the shell of the old. David Graeber referred to direct action as the defiant insistence on acting as if one is already free. And moving back to the mainline tradition, we can see this type of action in what Adam Thierer calls evasive entrepreneurship, and in what Tocqueville called the art and science of association. This type of direct evasion and defiance towards state power is something Carla Segovia, Molly Ravinsky, and I study in our ongoing work on the sanctuary movement. But as James C. Scott points out in Two Cheers for Anarchism, this type of resistance often occurs in sporadic forms that are never seen as a social movement. As Scott writes, quote, "There is a whole realm of what I have called infrapolitics because it is practiced outside the visible spectrum of what usually passes for political activity. By infrapolitics, I have in mind such acts as foot dragging, poaching, pilfering, dissimulation, sabotage, desertion, absenteeism, squatting, and flight. Why risk getting shot for a failed mutiny when desertion will do just as well? Why risk an open land invasion when squatting will secure de facto land rights? Why openly petition for rights to wood, fish, and game when poaching will accomplish the same purpose quietly? In many cases, these forms of de facto self-help flourish and are sustained by deeply held collective opinions about conscription, unjust wars, and rights to land and nature that cannot safely be ventured openly. And yet the accumulation of thousands or even millions of such petty acts can have massive effects on warfare, land rights, taxes, and property relations. The large mesh net political scientists and most historians use to troll for political activity utterly misses the fact that most subordinate classes have historically not had the luxury of open political organization. That has not prevented them from working microscopically, cooperatively, complicitly, and massively at political change from below. End quote. Being alert to these forms of resistance can help us better understand phenomena that would otherwise be unintelligible to us. It also shows us that a state's war effort can be thwarted not just by advocating a different public policy, but by commonplace acts of non-cooperation. Anarchists often self-consciously try to encourage these types of non-cooperation and evasion, describing them with various names such as prefigurative politics, direct action, and lines of flight. Studying the social organization of these anarchist movements can teach us a lot about the potential for human freedom and self-governance. Ruth Kinna of Loughborough University has extensively studied the constitutions of anarchist groups, a project that deserves further engagement from those of us who study constitutional political economy. Yes, I suggest that combining the work of Ruth Kinna with the work of James M. Buchanan can offer fruitful insights. Anarchists are constantly experimenting with different forms of voluntary association. Some of their projects are admirable and successful, others less so, but each represents a potential case study for enterprising social scientists. Many of these projects have not yet been written about in the academic literature. Many of these projects have not yet been written about in the academic literature. But if you're willing to look outside that literature to the communiques of anarchist activists, the zines and other literature they produce, or their discussions on podcasts like The Final Straw Radio and It's Going Down, you can learn a lot about the potentials, triumphs, and pitfalls of the art of association. Now, most movement anarchists are not economists. When you listen to them or read their literature, you might find yourself frustrated with claims they make about economics, markets, property, or capitalism. But if you read them, you may be surprised to find some points of agreement with mainline economics. Consider, for instance, the Italian anarcho-communist Errico Malatesta. His 1922 book, At the Cafe, is a series of dialogues between anarchist characters and various characters representing other social and political positions. My partner Andy showed me one excerpt from these dialogues that directly anticipates public choice. So this passage opens with Ambrosio, who is a character who's a magistrate, a judge, saying, "But if this government is elected by the people, doesn't it represent the will of those same people? What could you complain about?" And Giorgio, an anarchist character, replies, "This is simply a lie. A general, abstract, popular will is no more than a metaphysical fancy. The public is comprised of people, and people have 1,000 different and varying wills according to variations in temperament and in circumstances, and expecting to extract from them, through the magic operation of the ballot box, a general will common to all is simply an absurdity. A general will common to all is simply an absurdity. It would be impossible, he says, even for a single individual to entrust to somebody else the execution of their will on all the questions that could arise during a given period of time, because they themselves could not say in advance what would be their will on those various occasions. How could one speak for a collectivity, people, whose members at the very time of producing a mandate were already in disagreement among themselves? Just think for a moment at the way elections are held, and note that I intend speaking about the way they would work if all the people were educated and independent, and thus the vote perfectly conscious and free. You, for instance, would vote for whatever you regard as best suited to serve your interests and to apply your ideas. This is already conceding a lot, because you have so many ideas and so many different interests that you would not know how to find a person that thinks always like you on all issues. But will it be then to such a person that you will give your vote and who will govern you? By no means. Your candidate might not be successful, and so your will forms no part of the so-called popular will. But let's suppose that they do succeed. On what basis would this person be your ruler? Not even in your dreams. They would only be one among many. In the Italian parliament, for instance, one among 535. And you, in reality, will be ruled by a majority of people to whom you have never given your mandate. And this majority, whose members have received many different or contradictory mandates, or better still, have received only a general delegation of power without any specific mandate, unable, even if it wanted to ascertain a non-existent general will make everybody happy, will do as it wishes, or will follow the wishes of those who dominate it at a particular moment. So what does this sound like to you? To me, it sounds a fair bit like Chris Coyne's paper, Lobotomizing the Defense Brain, which by extension means that it sounds quite compatible with Buchanan's critique of social welfare functions and call for an individualistic rather than organismic model of government. In other words, he's saying we can't treat government as a representation of some general will or social welfare function. We need to understand that it results from interactions of individuals, some of whom are given decision-making power to act at the expense of others. Okay, so it may not be surprising that left-wing anarchists and mainline economists have some similar analyses of government. But what of their analysis of markets? Despite their tendency toward anti-market bias, some of the most influential anarcho-communist theorists recognize the marvel of what has been created through the market process. For instance, who would you guess said the following, quote, if we analyze all the great advances made in this century, our international traffic, our industrial discoveries, our means of communication, do we find that we owe them to the state or to private enterprise? Look at the network of railways which cover Europe. At Madrid, for example, you take a ticket for St. Petersburg direct. You travel across railroads which have been constructed by millions of workers, set in motion by dozens of companies. Your carriage is attached in turn to Spanish, French, Bavarian, and Russian locomotives. You travel without losing 20 minutes anywhere, and the 200 francs which you paid in Madrid will be to a nicety combined forward you to your destination. This line from Madrid to St. Petersburg has been constructed in small isolated branches, which have been gradually connected, and direct trains are the result of an understanding which has been arrived at between 20 different companies. Of course, there has been considerable friction at the outset, and at times some companies, influenced by an unenlightened egotism, have been unwilling to come to terms with the others. But I ask, was it better to put up with this occasional friction, or to wait until some Bismarck, Napoleon, or Genghis Khan should have conquered Europe, traced the lines with a pair of compasses, and regulated the dispatch of the trains? If the latter course had been adopted, we should still be in the days of stagecoaches. The network of railways is the work of the human mind, proceeding from the simple to the complex by the spontaneous efforts of the parties interested. And it is thus that all the great enterprises of our age have been undertaken. What thousands of examples one could cite in support of this same idea. Take all great enterprises such as the Suez Canal, the lines of Atlantic steamers, the telegraph which connects us with North and South America. Consider also the commercial organization which enables you, on rising in the morning, to find bread at the baker's, and all the other things that you want at other shops. Is this the work of the state? This passage could easily have come from a classical liberal economist marveling at the market process. Yet, in fact, it was from a speech titled The Place of Anarchism in Socialistic Evolution, a speech delivered by the anarcho-communist Peter Kropotkin. Now, of course, economists will find much to disagree with in other portions of the state, but it's interesting that when he's trying to show his fellow socialists that they can rely on bottom-up organization rather than on top-down regimentation and state control, he turns his analytical attention towards the fruits of the market process. I'm not suggesting that we'll find agreement with anarcho-communists on everything, but simply that their observations of the social world may have surprising affinities with ours, even on questions where we expect contentious disagreement. We should listen to them with an open mind, seeking opportunities for mutual learning. Today, I have encouraged you to look at the world with an anarchist squint. To avoid confusion, I should add a caveat. Viewing the world with an anarchist squint should not mean letting ideology dictate your research findings. You should not simply conclude that whatever is most convenient for anarchists is true. For instance, consider the question of whether police deter crime. It might be tempting for an anarchist to conclude that they don't. After all, then there's no serious trade-off to abolishing the state and their police forces. But such a conclusion would probably be misleading. At the level of theory, people respond to incentives. Demand curves slope downward. When the expected costs of doing something rise, we should expect the quantity demanded to fall, ceteris paribus. Moreover, this seems to be validated empirically, as research by our colleague Alex Tabarrok suggests. Once we have acknowledged that police deter crime, that doesn't mean we must support the state. We can then ask questions about alternative institutions of security provision, which opens a whole box of research questions in comparative institutional analysis. This has been a very fruitful research area for esteemed colleagues of ours such as Bruce Benson and Tate Fegley. To pick another example, if you decided that you really liked the works of Malatesta and Kropotkin, you might be tempted to reject the important insights of the Austrian school on economic calculation because you want to believe that abolishing private property is going to have good consequences. But you would be wrong to do so because the Austrians were right. They directly analyzed the implications of abolishing private property and the implications of having private exchangeable property rights, and recognized the crucial, critical role that prices, which can only be generated when there's free economic exchange, play in social learning, coordination, and discovery, right? So the point I'm trying to make here is that an anarchist squint must not mean closing your eyes to reality. Instead, it should be a way to see further, to open your imagination to additional possibilities, and therefore to explore research questions that others wouldn't ask. An anarchist squint expands our imagination, enabling us to consider possibilities that others ignore. In a world where states enact brutal violence, yet are seen as the primary protectors of peace, serious research on these possibilities is vital. To build a science of peace, we should build a science of liberty. To see possible paths to peace clearly, we should look at the world with an anarchist squint. Thank you very much.
All right, Nathan, thank you very much. That was wonderful. And we're very grateful to you for spending time with us and providing us some things to think about. We can discuss topics that interest anyone in the participation list. Just use your virtual hand to raise or raise your virtual hand, and Nathan or I can call on you. Let me start, Nathan, by asking you to say a little bit more about something you touched upon, and this is the shadow of the state type argument. You brought up the paper by Alex Salter and Vince Geloso. And I think this is one of the hardest things, of course, for people to get their head around on two margins, probably more than two, but two that I'll mention. One is purely looking out the window, meaning that people are so embedded in kind of their vision of the world being that there's this thing we call nation states. Nation states are the source of order. So that, as you put it in your comments, certainly there can be cooperation and order within that, within localized groups, but it requires that backstop in order to have order. So that's the vision issue. Or the other one, though, I think, is from a pure issue of analytics, which is that when we look out in the world, so let's put aside our normative kind of values, as you were talking about at the end of your talk, it's very hard analytically to disentangle things that we might observe in the world from the interaction effects with the nation state, which is in existence, either domestic or internationally, or some combination thereof. And so I wonder if you have any insights on how you might think about those things, both in the first regard, and I think you touched upon that quite nicely already, perhaps, in terms of opening your eyes to these alternatives. But analytically, do you have any thoughts on how we might address that?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and it's one that I don't have a fully fleshed out answer to by any means, but I think that there are a few things we can do. One, we can try to look to case studies where the shadow of the state is less of an issue, right? So, for instance, the work that people like Ben Powell and Pete Leeson did on post-state collapse Somalia, right? There you don't necessarily have as much of the state acting as a backstop. And so you've not fully removed it because obviously they're embedded in an international order where there are states that might intervene, but you're still looking there at something where the shadow of the state is less likely to be a thing. You can sometimes look into situations where you've got populations that significantly distrust the state or that know that the state will not enforce their agreements. So the work that's been done on organized crime, for instance, by people like David Scarbeck is useful for this, but there the shadow of the state comes in via a different mechanism, which is the prohibition is what's pushing people into those institutional arrangements. And so we can do model building exercises and theorizing exercises of thinking, all right, if we were starting absent the state, what might be rational strategies for actors to adopt? And so this can allow us to envision possibilities. But for empirical work, you're right. It's hard in a world that's so heavily dominated by nation states to find clean case studies. And so we always need to be tacking back and forth between theory and evidence and not treating historical evidence as dispositive, but instead simply as illustrative, and then using theory as a set of eyeglasses to interpret historical evidence and argue for the plausibility of different interpretations. So to take the shadow of the state people seriously, we should work through the implications of how the state has altered the incentives of the people interacting in the self-governing environments we're studying, and to consider how things might look outside the shadow of the state. We should consider what removing those incentives does, as well as consider maybe how states arise, right? So when people see states as a mechanism for solving collective action problems, sometimes they neglect that in order to create a state in the first place, you need to solve some collective action problems. And so the mechanisms of actually solving collective action problems have to, at least at some point in time, be something that can be done without relying on some state backstop. So those are a few ways to think about it, but I'm sure there are other ways that can be fruitfully employed, and I'd be interested in thoughts from others on this as well.
Yeah, thank you. Jamie.
Awesome talk, Nathan. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
You used a phrase at the beginning that I thought was really powerful. You talked about tolerance for confusion and improvisation being something that's missing. So I can imagine a couple responses to that. I can imagine that's a hard sell of a phrase to use when you're talking to people who prioritize law and order. Why the hell would we want more confusion? I can also see a comparative systems kind of response of, well, actually, one of the problems with our current military is that the system generates too much confusion because they're not systems that use knowledge well. And an alternative approach that was more bottom up might alleviate some of that confusion. So I'm curious about your thoughts kind of on that and the use of that phrase in discussing defense. But the main question I wanted to ask you is about this idea of power and control in one sphere spilling over into other spheres. Because to me, that's a very compelling idea. It makes a lot of sense to me. Vincent Ostrom and Paul has done some work building up on it, this idea of learning skills of self-governance in one sphere. So this is kind of like the other side of that coin, I guess. But in trying to operationalize this kind of idea, like Abby and I are trying to do in some of our research now, it can be difficult to operationalize. So I'm curious, as someone who's thought about this kind of issue, what are kind of the frameworks, the mechanisms that you think are most useful in studying how the use of power in one sphere affects the way power is used in other spheres?
Yeah, this is a really good question. So I guess first on the improvisation point, I really like the way you put that in terms of the comparative institutions' response to the objection. It reminded me of some of Kerzner's work and sort of how he says, look, you need the disequilibrium response in order to get the tendency towards equilibrium, right? And so I think that type of analysis can be applied fruitfully to these sorts of situations, right? If you attempt to impose an equilibrium or impose an orderly pattern in the first place, it's likely to become disordered as opposed to when you let things be discovered. But to the point about spillovers between different systems of power, I think there are a couple of different mechanisms and channels by which this could work. So one is a human capital channel, right? So this is something that in terms of the self-governing capabilities that you mentioned, right? People who are practiced in the art and science of association in one sphere, as you said, are likely to be able to apply it across other spheres. So there's liberatory human capital. And then as Coyne and Hall point out in Tyranny Comes Home, there's coercive human capital, right? And Michaela has also been doing some work on coercive skills, right? So there we would expect that, for instance, people who develop skills in the military or the police force for engaging in social control might carry out those similar skills in non-state activities. And Abby's written about this a bit, of course, in some of her work on how military veterans tend to join right-wing extremist groups. There's been some work on the tendency of military service to increase domestic abuse, right? So if people develop a set of skills related to violent control exercised against foreigners, they might unfortunately apply those same perverse skills in their intimate relationships. So that's a human capital channel. Then there's the reduced exit options or reduced entry options channel. So this seems to be most often used to explain the spillover from state power to power of incumbent businesses, right? So if you have a set of coercive government regulations, then even if workers are really dissatisfied with their employment situation or consumers are really dissatisfied with the options currently available to them, the coercive suppression of competitive entry means that workers are more likely to be in a monopsony situation, and consumers are more likely to find themselves in a situation where they're facing a monopoly, right? And so we'll see reductions in quality and more room for opportunism by the monopolists and monopsonists. But we can also see this in, again, the sphere of the more intimate sphere, right? So a situation where you have very restrictive zoning laws is one where the cost of housing is going to be a lot higher. And so if you're trying to flee an abusive relationship in that context, the cost of doing so is going to be higher in a situation where housing is more expensive than in a situation where it's less expensive. We could also think about immigration restrictions in a similar way, right? So if you're living in a society where you're facing threats, whether from the state or from an abusive partner or from a gang or from a hate group that's targeting you because of your identity or some immutable characteristic, or you're facing a really bad employer, but but all the employers are bad because you're in a poor country, right? Your ability to flee to better conditions is constrained coercively by immigration restrictions. And so that's another mechanism, is the restriction on exit. And of course, you've written about this extensively, both in your stuff on interjurisdictional competition, as well as in your withdrawing consent paper, right? So that's the second mechanism. So we've got human capital, we've got the exit mechanism. I'd say there's probably a physical capital channel, just like in the Coyne and Hall work in Tyranny Comes Home. There's an organizational dynamics channel, right? So people are going to be able to adopt the types of organizations that they're used to adopting. People who are used to interacting in an organization that uses discussion based on Liberty Fund rules are going to be able to have more orderly discussions on an equal footing with one another. People who are only used to operating in organizations where one person gives orders to another person are more likely to adopt organizational forms that involve that type of command and control dynamic. And related to this, we could draw on Kenneth Boulding's concept of the image, right? So what people envision as a possibility depends on what they've experienced. And so people who have primarily experienced relationships with command and control, but have little experience in bottom-up self-organization, are likely to envision coercive control as the mechanism for resolving problems. People who are used to relationships of inequality rather than relationships of relating to one another as dignified equals are likely to envision status hierarchy as an immutable fact of the social world rather than as something changeable. And so what people see as possible is another area where we can expect spillovers, whether in a positive or negative direction.
Awesome. I took super careful notes. Don't be surprised if you see me using a lot of these phrases and citing a lot of these things in my work. But
Awesome.
while you were talking, it just reminded me of one thing that I wanted to suggest, because you're writing this up as a paper, right? Or you already have, or you will, or...
So I've written it up as a talk. I'm not sure whether I'll write it up as a paper, but I'd like to. I think that if I can think of a good venue for it, I'd be interested in doing so.
Well, if you do, a cool example of conscious acts of non-cooperation that would go along with kind of this anarchist squint idea is the free love movement, the 19th century one. And so I need to incorporate more about it in some of my own work too. But I was just reading about Antoinette Brown Blackwell, who was the first ordained minister in the United States. And she was like one of many feminists. You know, Lucy Stone is another big one, who just said, okay, like the best solution to this is just going to be for us to not participate in marriage at all. So if state control of the marriage relationship is going to be so coercive, we're just going to like put ourselves to the side and voluntarily non-cooperate rather than any other kind of resistance. But again, very cool talk. Thank you, Nathan.
Thank you. Yeah. I think there was similar stuff from others in the free love movement, right? Like Voltairine declares, "They who marry do ill," and I think the Harmons got married without state recognition as a way of dealing with this. Thank you so much.
Scandalous.
Meredith.
Thank you, Nathan. I very much enjoyed the talk and getting to learn from this research in you. One quick comment. I thought that a paper by Alexander Wendt might be helpful for you or people on this call. It's Anarchy is What States Make of It, the Social Construct of Power Politics. I don't know if anyone's familiar with it, but it's a really interesting article where he argues that the world order could have come to three worlds: competitive, individualistic, or collective security, and that we are in a competitive world because of state behavior and distribution and capabilities. I think that paper could be really interesting for you. Also, again, people a part of this group, we could localize it more as opposed to Wen, who's looking at from an international system. But just wanted to share that. A lot of what you were saying reminded me of that paper. But the question that I had for you about the talk is I was hoping you could speak a little bit more generally, either in your opinion or kind of from the literature that you pull upon, about the use of violence. So you had said that states use violence, threat of violence on their civil population in foreign nations. None of that is revolutionary. And I think maybe to take one step back, I believe a lot of this arguments, like I believe in a lot about what we say here about a decentralized state, bottom-up approach, a localized level. The only argument that I have a hard time buying or understanding is the monopoly of force. And so I was wondering, for example, we live in the United States, right? Like how I have a hard time rationalizing the localization of national defense. And so I was just wondering if you could maybe talk more about that in regards to this framework, and what does it look like if the state does not have the monopoly on force, or what kind of institutions or framework would help enforce laws in national defense. So it's kind of rambling, but I'd just love to get your thoughts on any of that.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I really appreciate the Alexander Wendt recommendation, and it opens up a whole conversation that I considered including here, but didn't, the role of anarchy as a metaphor within international relations theory, right? Because there's not a external enforcer that can enforce rules upon nation states. So IR theorists often model the international community as operating in a state of anarchy. There's actually some interesting dovetailing with the mainline tradition on this, in that Keohane, an influential international relations theorist, had collaborated a bit with Eleanor Ostrom on some projects connecting some of her stuff on self-governance of common pool resources with issues of international governance. But so the question of polycentric provision of national defense and moving beyond sort of the monopoly on the use of force, I guess one question that we should ask is, to what extent does the Weberian model of the state as a monopoly on the use of force actually apply to real states, right? So how often, under what range of conditions do they actually hold the monopoly on socially legitimized use of force, right? So actually existing states are polycentric, might have, or many of them might have multiple spheres of sovereignty, right? The local and municipal police departments might have some degree of independence from federal national bureaucracies. And so we might see some degree of this polycentricity playing out even in the operation of existing states. Then there's the presence of groups like organized criminal groups, certain types of extra groups that sometimes can contest that monopoly on the use of force. And of course, contestation of that monopoly can often lead to worse outcomes, right? So my claim is not a situation that is visibly anarchic in the sense of the state's monopoly on force being challenged is necessarily better than any given situation involving a state that appears to have a monopoly on the legitimate use of force. That's not a claim that I'd be willing to defend, because you can certainly have anarchic contexts that are worse than some state contexts. We need to use comparative institutional analysis and approach that with an open mind, rather than assuming that it's always and everywhere going to be. But to the question of national defense in particular, I guess there's going to be multiple scales, and different types of threats are going to require different scales of decision making. So under national defense, we include everything from fending off an invading army to defending against terrorism, and a bunch of things in between those. And so terrorist attacks are an interesting example, in that often the effects are more localized than a full-scale invasion of a country, for example. We bundle that as a national security issue. So if, say, a terrorist were to attack the Super Bowl, right, that would obviously have effects across the whole nation, because huge numbers of people would be watching it. It would be really upsetting for everybody. But the actual event being targeted is much more localized, right? That is a that is occurring within a football stadium that could, in principle, have their own security and have it be administered privately, as many venues do, right? And so that would be a situation where we think of it as a national security threat. And in fact, the Department of Homeland Security, including the Border Patrol, is very involved in a bunch of policing and surveillance surrounding the Super Bowl each year. But at least in principle, that's an example where the attack would be localized enough that it seems like the security against it could be provided in a bottom-up way, and the costs and benefits of doing that would be relatively internalized. Likewise, with air traffic hijacking, right? It seems like airlines providing their own security, or airports and airlines cooperating to provide security, could work, even if there are obviously spillovers from airline hijackings, right? It becomes harder with things like something like a land invasion. But even there, it seems as though if you had a stateless context, one, the capacities that were used to engage in the process of casting off a state might include a set of skills that would make a people difficult to conquer, right? So the very things that made you capable of engaging in some type of anarchist revolution, whether of a directly violent kind or of a peaceful kind or a routing around the state until it's obsolete kind, would be skills that would also be useful for preventing conquest, because you'd have people who are adept at resisting these things. People might, in the process, there are various people who organize to do violence who aren't without to say, or to build skills in violence, right? Gun clubs, militias, these sorts of things exist in the United States. So we could imagine them carrying on defensive capabilities. So none of this is to say that it's guaranteed to work well, but simply that there's a range of possibilities beyond just a Bavarian nation state for these things. And it's worth engaging in comparative institutional analysis across these diversities of options. And that I would like there to be people doing these who come from a variety of ideological perspectives, including people who aren't committed political anarchists, because I think that'll lead to better work. Contestation between people who are more inclined to want the stuff to work well and people who are like, no, I actually think the state is the best mechanism for providing security, right? Contestation between those perspectives in a comparative institutional analysis that's taking these seriously as possibilities will, I think, lead us towards better science and better research. So thank you for raising these questions. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Pete?
Great talk, Nathan.
Thank you.
I actually am going to suggest this to Chris, but I'll do it publicly to get some more weight on it. But I think actually the RAE should publish every year the annual lectures. So as an outlet, I think it's a very useful use of our pages to highlight these talks and this issue. Part of it is because of not only Boulding's interest in knowledge processing aspects and stuff like that, just Boulding in general, but there's also this issue that just mentioned, which is independent of like the normative issues of anarchism, but basically the idea that any notion of a true like understanding of economic processes is going to be messynomics. I like the way that you captured it, which is comfort with chaos, because that is a key issue. Chris knows this, but there's a great economic journalist named Tim Harford, and he wrote a book where he describes this stuff as messynomics, right? And that what we have to do is be willing to embrace messynomics if we're going to talk about, constant change and everything like that. And, most people don't want to deal with the consequences of change in our own lives, right? Let alone in our analytical tractability, because you can't have something smooth and continuous and twice differentiable and have it be messy. It's just not going to be the case. And so therefore you give up something, right? But it's only a giving up something if you believe that we need to have precision for control. Right. And so if our social sciences are sciences of control, then we can't have messynomics. Right. But if our social sciences are for sciences of understanding, then we can embrace, as you put it, the chaos and the confusion and all that stuff like that as part of the beauty of life. I mean, that's, what it means to live with all its, Kerzner used to refer to it as the on the individual level. He says you must wrestle with the agony of choice. All right. Max Hughes, subject to constraints, doesn't have any agony of choice. right? Yeah. Anyway, I wanted to ask you if you knew of this book. I don't think you were here. Yeah, I think you were at NYU when I used it in class. But it's called Effective Governance Under Anarchy, Institutions, Legitimacy, and Social Trust in Areas of Limited Statehood. Now, like a lot of this literature, like, for example, James Scott or whatever, the examples are not modern economic growth examples, right? They're always, but the Hmong lived among each other for 1,000 years without a state and within peace, but they just didn't develop. They lived in a mud hut, right? And so very few of us want to say that we want to go to a mud hut and do things. So like in the Somalia example, it may be the case that, the relevant choice isn't between, Somalia with a country with governance like Denmark or Somalia with governance by warlords, because the only way that, they have in their possibility is governance by warlords. But I don't know if that's what we want to embrace, right? I think that we have to, as a reality, say that societies without formed states operate like X, and we need to study that. But our real normative claim is that we can get rid of the state and we can have increases in peace and prosperity. And I think we have to bear the burden of that argument in some sense. I'm not saying you have to in this talk, but I'm just saying as people that have this anarchist, what did you call it? The glimpse anarchist or whatever? Squint. Yeah, it's a great, yeah. Everything about your talk is great, from the title all the way through to the content.
Thank you.
But yeah, I would have said that, Nathan, if you didn't even give me some love in the talk. So I just think it's a really great, way to think about these issues. But you should look at this book, Effective Governance Under Anarchy. It's by Borzell and Rise, R-I-S-S-E, Rees, I guess. And it's a Cambridge University Press book, and it was published in 2021.
Okay, thank you. That's really helpful. I will check that out. And I absolutely agree that the question of how we achieve prosperity, can we achieve prosperity under anarchy, is an important one. And I mean, that's part of what Salter and Geloso try to address in that paper I mentioned on state capacity and development.
If I can say one last thing on this,
it deserves more research.
I used to say this to Ed all the time, Stringham, is that if you look at his own arguments, what he shows is that the state is not necessary to get the advanced exchanges between parties. So to get a stock market, you don't need a state to get the origins of the stock market. But in every instance, historically, the state co-opts the stock market and then you get development. So it's never the case that you get development, then the state takes over. It's that you are in the process of development when the state already co-opts it. And so part of this is scalability and sustainability. And that's why you have an after this, therefore because of this kind of idea with state capacity. But imagine a thought experiment where the government doesn't come in to regulate London stock markets, or the government doesn't come in to like take over the Amsterdam bourse or whatever. What would happen? Would that have been truncated, or can we run a trend line experiment in our heads, thought experiment, where it could have evolved and developed without the shadow of the state? Because everywhere we turn, we have the shadow of the state. And so Leeson tries to get at this with the New York Convention and trade, right? But this is a big challenge, I think, to all of us, because most of our examples are examples in which the level of development is not very high.
Yeah.
So we got to wrestle with that, I think.
Yeah, and I think some of the contemporary digital examples could be helpful for thinking through, right, like ways in which people use contemporary technology to evade the state. Could be like some of Theor's stuff, some of Trent McDonald's stuff, all that.
Yeah, Michaela, I think, has thought about this with respect to blockchain and things like that. Yes. So, yeah. All right. Great talk.
Thank you.
Also relevant, which is what I was trying to get at with my shadow of the state and interaction effects, is spurious correlation. So because the state, therefore the state, perhaps, but maybe not. Maybe people don't fight with each other despite the state having a lot of weapons, not because of it. That's something we always need to keep in mind, I think, which is easy to neglect when you prioritize the state as the source of the background order. Michael.
Thanks. Thank you, Nathan. I really enjoyed your talk. In one of your responses, you mentioned Kenneth Boulding's concept of the image, and I had a question on that. Something I've been sort of thinking about is you mentioned how because the state is so involved in solving problems that perhaps we regularly experience in our lives, that we have a tendency to take it for granted that the state going forward should solve those problems or should solve those problems or are the only people capable of solving those problems. And it brought to mind something that I was recently revisiting with Mises, talking about the significance of our ability to recognize the benefits that we get from participating in the division of labor, and how that the importance of that capacity for recognizing that leads us to engage in more social cooperation than we otherwise could. And so my question, tying that into the image, is what sort of opportunities do you think there are for kind of institutions or maybe ways that image of social cooperation as opposed to command and control can become more taken for granted? One thing that I was thinking about, and I'm curious what your thoughts are, is the extent to which like economics education could help cultivate that image, and opportunities where maybe that can be better conveyed to the general public.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. And I think that's really important. I think it's one of the most important things that we do as teachers, regardless of which audience we're engaging with, right? I think there's so much that people take for granted about the division of labor and spontaneous order and social cooperation. And whereas when top-down methods of control are used to achieve goals, the proponents of the policy that engages in those top-down methods of control trumpet it and are very explicit that that's what they're doing. Whereas by necessity, because spontaneous orders are not the result of any human design, there's not some designer who proudly says, "It's me, I did that," right? Instead, you need to actually engage in an analytical effort to understand the process by which bottom-up social cooperation emerges. And so that's really one of the most important things we can do in economics education. And that certainly should happen in the formal classroom. It should happen in our engagements with our scientific and scholarly peers in other disciplines, right? Which is to say that we should seek opportunities to engage productively with other people's scholarship and show the complementarities between what they're observing in the world and an understanding of spontaneous order, market processes, bottom-up social change, and peace, productivity, cooperation, and prosperity emerging from the bottom up, right? We should seek opportunities to teach those lessons across disciplinary boundaries. We do this, of course, with our programs at the Hayek program, where we engage with graduate fellows across a wide range of disciplines. We should seek to do it in our public writing, right? So when you read the news both with your price theory eyeglasses on and with an anarchist squint, and think, all right, is there an opportunity for an op-ed in this that could really illuminate bottom-up social processes? When you're engaging with pop culture, think about whether there might be lessons from it. And, if you see something that you think would be a really good illustration of one of these relevant economic principles, maybe reach out to Amy Willis at Liberty Fund and say, hey, I'd like to submit a Liberty Fund blog post on this, or an Econlog blog post on this, right? Always be alert to opportunities to engage with people in a wide range of spheres of life about the possibility of bottom-up social cooperation, because people need to be able to envision it and imagine it and understand what it achieves, or else they're going to be vulnerable to the siren song that's delivered by a strongman, which is a horrible mixed metaphor, but you know what I mean.
All right.
Thanks.
Are there any other questions or comments for Nathan? Jordan.
Yeah, hey Nathan, thanks for the talk. It was great. I'm wondering,
Thank you.
in terms of this anarchist squint and then communicating ideas, do you think maybe we underutilize the example of international arbitration between firms as like, hey, look, out there in the anarchic world where there's not one world government, we have firms, doing what they need to do without necessarily resorting to state courts. We have these. Do you think that's something that is like something we can point to and say, look, anarchy happens every single day, and basically everything you buy or eat is based on these anarchic relations of cooperation? I don't know if you have do you think that's a selling point? How do we frame that to be more persuasive?
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. And I think that it's one that can be, of course, fruitfully tied to the literature that we often do cite on the Lex Mercatoria, right? Because what Benson's talking about, as well as later work by folks like Leeson, on the way in which international merchant law developed is exactly on this point, right? You're in a context where you can't easily appeal to a single state to resolve your disputes because you're coming at it from different jurisdictions. You might each be worried that the opposing jurisdiction will be biased against you, and so you have an incentive to develop alternative dispute resolution mechanisms and alternative governance mechanisms, and people have done that. And so being able to point to that and to have more robust evidence about that, so that if people ask follow-up questions, we know how to answer those follow-up questions, right? There will be the shadow of the state argument of, well, each of the people who are parties to the dispute, they are citizens of a state, so maybe that's the backstop, people might say. Or people might raise objections related to some state co-option of this international merchant legal framework or international economic dispute resolution. So we should learn the history well so that we can effectively engage with those objections, either acknowledging them to whatever extent they're true, or pushing back on them to the extent that we have good responses. And so I think this type of research directly extending some of the earlier work on the Lex Mercatoria and seeing how does that extend into the modern day would be really helpful. So I really appreciate you raising that example, and I think this would be a really fruitful project or set of projects. Thanks.
Anyone else before we part ways? Pete.
I was looking for that and raising my hand at the same time. So this is actually relevant to like what you wrote to me yesterday with that Dejase, issue, because and it's related to Andreas's work about crony capitalism. Is there any way, absent of do you believe, Nathan, that there's a way with an anarchist sort of glimpse that we could talk about tying the ruler's hands, or is it simply impossible to tie the ruler's hands, and that's just the romantic as believing there's going to be a transformation of the human spirit? I mean, where do you stand on that issue?
Yeah, I'm somewhat agnostic on it. So I think that we can't treat the rules in form as identical to the rules in use. So just because we have a well-written, well-designed constitution in terms of what it says, that can't be treated as enough. But it might be that certain types of constitutional arrangements could be effective if they have certain incentive properties, right? So for instance, maybe certain types of competitive federalism would be effective at tying the ruler's hands because the presence of exit and interjurisdictional competition renders it incentive compatible to be, restrained. But the problem there, of course, is we've seen the actual erosion of competitive federalism into cartel federalism, right? And we've seen the sort of stuff that you write about in your work with Jamie and Leah on how community policing got distorted into this thing via federal interventions and so on. So I think that it provides us with possible ways forward. And we could also look at what mechanisms are adopted by those who are explicitly trying to do this in terms of their voluntary associations, right? So the work that I mentioned from Ruth Kinna, where she's looking at contemporary anarchist social movement groups and the constitutions they set up, which will often, at least in the small meeting scale, have like unanimity rules for certain types of decisions. I think you could very fruitfully apply like the calculus of consent to analyzing some of those constitutions. You might see, okay, what types of constitutionalizing do people do in their bottom-up non-state social arrangements, where there's, even in those, there's risks of certain kinds of rulership emerging. And so maybe you can tie the ruler's hands better to the extent that the ruler isn't recognized as a sovereign over some set of territory, right? But instead is like a manager or a individual trusted to be the treasurer of a club or whatever, right? Like to the extent that, or an arbitrator, right? To the extent that they have certain prerogatives that could become rulership, but they're not given the level of privilege associated with running a state. Maybe it's easier to tie the ruler's hands, but there's still a challenge. And so we might see better possibilities there. Likewise, if we look in like Lynn Ostrom's stuff, often the commons governance arrangements are to some degree entangled with states, right? Not always, but sometimes. And so there we could see what mechanisms do the resource users develop themselves. So I'm not gonna go as far as Dejase and saying that it's completely impossible to, that it's purely a romantic fantasy, but I think it's a really hard problem. And I think that looking at constitutionalizing activities, both within formal states and within the various forms of social organization outside the state, can help us try to figure out the answer to these problems, even if we never come to a satisfying final answer.
Hey, Pete, just to provide context, Pete and I were texting yesterday about 2025 being the anniversary of both The Reason of Rules and The State by Anthony Dejase. And I sent Pete Buchanan's review of The State, which was published in Public Choice. And in the concluding paragraph of that review, Buchanan says, look, Dejase presents a challenge for us constitutional scholars because his churning state, what he calls a churning state, what Buchanan would have called the unproductive / predatory state, is an empirical reality. But Buchanan says, look, the project, the constitutional project, even though it might be a dream, is to think about tying the ruler's hands. The interesting thing is you can flip that over, Nathan, and use that same logic for your argument, which is we could say the empirical reality is we see states around us, but as Buchanan puts it, the dream or the pursuit of the vision of an alternative is the intellectual project and one of great interest. And with that, let me thank you again for doing this, Nathan. We all appreciate it very much. And I want to thank all of you for taking the time to join us today.